a great pleasure to talk to my former colleague, present colleague, Keith Hart. Thank you very much, Keith, for agreeing to do this at short notice. Can we start with when were you born?
1943 in Manchester.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me something about your parents and background there?
Yes, my father left school at 14, went to night school, got a degree equivalent in electrical engineering and joined the post office. My mother was middle class but downwardly mobile, at least at that time. And we lived in Old Trafford, which was in the shadow of Trafford Park, the industrial estate of Manchester. And we moved there to be near my father's mother, and so that my mother could have her firstborn in the place she came from. So I lived in an area that was quite poor and run down, and became more so as a result of the war because of the bombing and so on. But my family had a rather up and down trajectory through the class structure. So there was experience of being middle class as well as the experience of being quite poor. And our poverty was exaggerated by my father buying heavily into the breadwinner housewife model. So he would never allow my mother to work. And it took him a long time to reach the managerial level in the post office telephones. Until I was a teenager. So, you know, we grew up under conditions of some austerity in a rundown area, but with very strong aspirations for upward mobility, which were eventually realized not just by me, but by my father.
Did the personality or interests of either of them have a big influence on you in any way?
Well, I think what I learned, what I got from my father was the idea that we should not accept being excluded from any kind of human activity that we might be interested in. So he was a scientist and engineer, very much interested in numbers. He was a semi-professional singer in choirs and opera societies. He played the flute and later the piano. He was a fan of Alexandre Dumas' novels. He studied the stars. He brewed beer and later wine. And he was fanatical about sport, played tennis and badminton until he was 60 and was the oldest member of his golf club in his late 80s by several years. And so, you know, he, I think, gave me the sense that one can engage with anything, really, and that it's really stupid to imagine that one is either a numbers person or a words person or a music person and not all these other, a sports person and so on. And he opened up to me the idea that the world was my oyster, you can do anything you like, you don't have to be the best at it. Although that was a lesson that I didn't learn at first, because for example, I was a boy soprano of some excellence, and you know, I sang on the radio and things like that, and I was in 3 choirs. And then my voice broke, and they said my voice wasn't any good anymore. It was mediocre now, and so I just gave up singing, because if I couldn't be the best, I wasn't going to do it at all. So I didn't learn that lesson of my dad's, that you can enjoy doing things without being necessarily the best at it.
So, moving on to your schooling, I know you went to Manchester Grammar School. That was very difficult to get into. How did you manage to get into it?
Well, when I was 8 years old, we went to see an aunt in Bedford and made a visit to Cambridge, and I apparently said, why have they got so many churches here? And I was told these are not churches, they're schools. And I said, when I grow up, I want to go to a school that looks like a church. And this was then translated into a family myth: Keith wants to go to Cambridge. And I mean, I entered the examination process for Manchester Grammar School when I was 9. and failed. I mean, the system they were recruiting from a radius of 50 miles from Manchester, as far apart as Blackpool and Huddersfield. Kids could only enter the exam if their headmaster nominated them. There were 10,000 entrants every year. These were reduced to 2,000 by the first exam, and the second exam reduced them from 2,000 to 200. And obviously people who had had private schooling and so on. I mean, I was the first person from my area of Manchester ever to go to Manchester Grammar School. It made it onto the front page of the Stretford newspaper. There's this guy who got into not only Manchester Grammar School but William Hume's and Stretford, and it was really quite unusual at that time. And I always felt when I was there that I was a stranger in a largely middle-class society that I was unfamiliar with, and I never brought people from school home. I just didn't feel that I could mix the two.
Were there any teachers who particularly influenced you at Manchester?
Yes, there was. I was a classicist, and there were some really excellent scholars in Latin and Greek that I learnt from. But the people who were really the people who were inspiring were the English teachers. They had some amazing English teachers. There was a guy called Cockshut who later became an Oxford Don, who was a published expert on Trollope and Dickens. There was a guy who ran BBC radio drama for a while, and there were others who were specialists and very animated about Shakespeare and so on. So, and I've now come to see that I've always lived a double life, which is that I saw my future as lying through examination passing into the analytical professions, as it were, and that was always my kind of speciality, passing exams and mastering the analytical techniques in language and maths. I was also interested in. But my passion was always for fiction, for plays, for novels, movies. And so this was fed by English, which was a subject that I never intended to be examined in, but which allowed me in school to be exposed to some very inspiring teachers.
But you did specialise in classics.
Yeah.
Which then led on. Well, actually, I just wanted to ask you. You mentioned just now that you were thinking about a virtual Manchester of your mind idea. What did you mean by that?
Well, I wrote a memoir not long ago called Manchester on My Mind, which was about the role that the city that I grew up in has played in my search for a role as an anthropologist, and it's divided into 10 episodes, and it starts by trying to give a realistic description of what Manchester was in the post-war period, but obviously as I've become more internationally mobile and my family has more or less moved on out of Old Trafford and Manchester into other places, Manchester has become a kind of an imagined past for me, which is symbolized. I live in Paris now, and I have a bottle of Manchester United Chardonnay on my desk, and the symbol is that in 1950, if you had asked whether little Keithy from Old Trafford would ever become a writer living in Paris, this would be no less surprising than that Manchester United in the 1990s would be selling cheap French plonk to its supporters. So I see Manchester United's rise, since they also have a home in my neighbourhood, their rise to being the richest, the most famous club in the world, as a sort of totemic analogue to my own improbable, let's not call it rise, but achievement of a degree of existential freedom, let's say, to move in the world.
Thanks. And then what led you to... Did you go to Cambridge?
I did, yes. I won a scholarship to Cambridge.
To read?
Classics.
Did you enjoy it?
Well, I was and am besotted with the classics. I mean, I was mainly a technical linguist. I mean, I was a superb translator in both directions, prose, verse. I mean, I won a prize for translating Dante into Homeric hexameters, for example. And but I was also interested less interested in the substance of philosophy, literature, history at that time. And but I was mainly interested in the Greek tragedians, especially Aeschylus, and the Latin lyric poets, especially Catullus. But at that time, before classics renewed itself by becoming a kind of postmodern critical discipline, one had very limited options for pursuing a PhD. I never imagined that I would be anything other than a professional academic. So it was a question, what kind of academic? And I mean, at that time, I would not have been allowed to study Aeschylus because that had been done. I mean, the job of a literary scholar in the classics was to improve and extend the manuscript tradition, which meant that I would have had to work on some obscure 4th century Roman satirist that was only available in fragments, and I wasn't interested in that. And I also felt that the intellectual narrowness with which the discipline was approached, at least in literature, was one that I couldn't identify with. So there was that, and also since I was a professional kind of examination passer looking for a life in the free professions, I couldn't help noticing that classics had attracted a large number of provincial bright boys like me, seeking a dwindling number of jobs for which it seemed that British society was not going to expand. So, and this was a period when social sciences were expanding very rapidly in the 60s. And so I looked for an alternative career in the social sciences. I first thought of sociology, but that didn't appeal because in Cambridge it was subordinate to economics at the time, and funnily enough, in terms of my later interests, I didn't want to touch economics with a barge pole, and I could only study sociology as a subset of a set of economic courses. And then I heard of social anthropology, which seemed to be sociology with travel thrown in, which seemed quite good. And I had a rowing coach. I was a cox for Lady Margaret, called Claudio Vita Finzi, who was a geographer of the Mediterranean basin. And every winter he went off to Sicily or Lebanon, came back in time for the maize. Thought that was not a bad life. And of course Jack Goody was in my college and was a kind of, I was in St. John's, yeah. And Jack was, to some extent, a drinking companion, because both of us spent quite a lot of time in the bar then, and perhaps since. and you know, so Jack actually was running a seminar in the anthropology department on clientship. It was the year, at the time when Mackay,
What date was this?
62 maybe. I went up in 61, as maybe 62, 3, and Mackay had produced his book on Rwanda, and anyway, Jack was doing a comparative clientship thing. And I, in the bar one day, said, I'll do one on Roman clientship for you if you like. And he took me up on it. I forgot. And then about 2 days before the seminar, he said, well, you're on next Wednesday, you know. And so I did something that I would never have dreamed of doing for an ordinary tutorial in classics, which is that I went to the library and mugged up on the Cambridge ancient history and a whole bunch of secondary sources. I mean, what I would have had to do, if I'd done an essay for my classics tutor, I would have had to have read all the original texts in Latin, Cicero, Tacitus, and so on, that dealt with the subject, and then use those texts as the basis for my essay. But instead I just did this kind of loose secondary interpretation based on books I could read in English. And I gave my talk, and the people treated it as if it was enormously sophisticated and brilliant. And I thought, my God, these people have no intellectual standards. It's going to be a snooze if I move in on them. I really felt, you know, that in moving from classics to anthropology, I was moving, like being transferred from AC Milan to Stockport County. I mean, I had a sense that these people, what I admired about the anthropologists was that they felt they could study anything. But they seemed to have no intellectual standards of method or, you know, how you went about it. And it seemed to me the mirror image of what was dissatisfying about classics was, which was pinning me down in this really quite rigorous but increasingly narrow discipline. And anthropology was just sort of opening up the world, so I transferred.
Well, you mentioned Jack, and you had a lot of... He was your supervisor.
He was the only supervisor I had as an undergraduate and as a postgraduate.
Can you say something about Jack for the record?
Yeah, at the time, I thought he was a lousy teacher. I mean, I really thought he didn't listen. I couldn't engage him. I didn't think he read my stuff most of the time. And I certainly felt that with my thesis. I mean, I never got any real feedback from him. And, I mean, he supported me very well, emotionally, socially, and so on. But I didn't really feel, and I thought Jack was a lousy lecturer. I mean, unlike Edmund, he stumbled through his stuff, and it didn't seem to, when I was an undergraduate, when I was a postgraduate, and I asked him, should I take some supervisions? He said, yeah, as long as it doesn't distract you from your real work. So teaching seemed to be something that was secondary to the accumulation of the goody opus or whatever. And yet many years later he wrote the first book in his great series of kind of world historical comparisons, production and reproduction. He has a really effective and short and very personal introduction to his own motives and history. It's only a page and a half, and he lays out about kind of 3 principles that he has been animated by. And I went through these, and the first one, I ticked it off and said, yes, I agree with that. And then second one, I agreed with that. And the third one, I read this thing and I said, bloody hell, I mean, it can't be accidental that the things that I think are most important in the anthropological project, he's laying out as his agenda since 1950. So what I discovered in retrospect was that Jack had taught me in a way that I was too arrogant or closed to recognize at the time. And maybe he taught me by example, not by instruction. And anyway, in this long unpublished Festschrift of his that has been coming out for about the last 6 years, I wrote what has become the kind of...
Does he know about this?
I don't know whether he knows about it.
He will now.
Well, I mean, it's about time he knew.
Yeah.
No, I mean, at one stage, Juliet was going to do the editing, so he must know about it.
Okay.
But it's been in the works for so long, and it's been through different editorial readership. But my article is the first one after the introduction.
Yeah.
And it's called Agrarian Civilization and World Society. And it's my appreciation of his work and what I feel his position is as I think, one of the very few anthropologists of the second half of the 20th century who actually embraced the study of world history as a project that escaped from the limitations of a more narrow ethnography, which he was also originally rooted in. And it's my belated attempt to appreciate him as a mentor. And when I wrote my book on West African agriculture, I dedicated it to him and Maya Fortis, because by then, at least by 1980 or thereabouts, I realized how much I owed to these people. But at the time, I mean, in the 60s, we all thought we were orphans. At least you may not have, but I did. I mean, I felt that I owed nothing to my parents, to their generation, to my teachers. I mean, I thought my teachers were all basically locked into a past I didn't want anything to do with. So I didn't look to them for inspiration, guidance, right? I mean, I had this manic notion, you know, that me and the people like me were going to make the world from scratch in our own way. So it meant that I had no real sense of what I owed to the people who made me, until later.
Well, the other person you mentioned then was Maya Fortis.
Yeah.
Also, as you mentioned, has had an influence on him. What was Maya like?
Well, I had very little to do with Maya as an undergraduate. In fact, my main guide and inspiration was Audrey Richards, who was she was director of the African Studies Centre, and she gave a course on urbanization and migration that lodged in my mind the idea for my own PhD project, which was studying migration and urbanization in Ghana. And she, you know, I was much closer to her.
Well, say something about Audrey then first.
Well, I mean, Audrey was very supportive to me, and she was. I mean, I also had a tutor who was a historian called Ronald Robinson, who was a leading historian of Africa, and Robbie and Audrey were big in African studies and the SMARTs, which ran kind of African and South Asian studies at Cambridge, and they were my sponsors. They got me my basic funding for fieldwork, even though I chose a place, Ghana, that was that Jack and Maya would have identified with. I mean, I wasn't interested in Ghana as such, but I thought that they would try harder to fund me if I went where they went. But Audrey made me feel, you know, that I had something to say. I gave a seminar paper for her that she said she wanted to publish or, you know, put in for a prize or something if I would write it up. And when I wrote it up, she read it and said, "My God, I thought you had something to say, but this is rubbish." And she also, you know, I mean, I wrote an essay for her once, and she said, "Look, I want you to go away and write this again, in, you know, but make it empirically specific." And I thought, you know, but that's not the interesting thing. I mean, the interesting thing is my ideas. So I wrote it again, as boring and detailed a way as I could. And she said, "All right, Keith, now we know you can walk. We can discuss your aspiration to fly." So she was wonderful. A wonderful old bird. She later, you know, she gave me a jam thermometer as a wedding present, which I think is typical of her. And she also gave me, my wife, advice along the lines of, if you see something you like, buy 4 of them. No, I mean, Audrey I had an immense respect and affection for. Maya I didn't know at all. I thought Maya was also a terrible teacher. I thought he wasn't interested in engaging with us at all. And he had a seminar for the final year students, and I went to one of them and then quit because I just couldn't stand it. And so the paradox was that, you know, Jack set me up to do research in Ghana, in Accra, on migrants, and I realized I had to pick a group from somewhere that was known in the literature so that I wouldn't have to start from scratch. And it really meant studying Jack's or Maya's people. And Jack made it fairly clear he didn't want me trespassing on his territory. So and I ought to say also that I went into the field immediately after graduating, after having had only 2 years as an undergraduate. I just went straight out into the field. And then I wrote to my 40s, who I'd hardly seen.
You said 2 years as an undergraduate. You did anthropology.
I did 2 years part 1 classics, and then switched and got an extra year to do a 2-year part 2 social anthropology.
Right, thank you.
And I ought to say that the director of studies at that time in St John's for Arc and Downs was Glyn Daniel, and he, you know, I thought sabotaged my future career by forcing me to spend the intervening long vacation reading physical anthropology and archaeology to make up for the lack of part 1. But anyway, so Meyer didn't know who I was, and I turned up with a first. In fact, my contemporaries in that class included Johnny Parry and Caroline Humphrey and Enid Schildkraut, who was also a student of Jack's going out to Ghana, now in New York. I mean, there were quite a large number of us who ended up as professional anthropologists. Pepe Roberts was another. And, but, you know, Meyer didn't know who the hell I was because, you know, I mean, I never turned up. I didn't go to many lectures. I mean, I still had this arrogance, this notion these people haven't got much to teach me. The only lecturer that I really enjoyed was Edmund. And Tambi had arrived at that time in my college, as it happened. Tambaya. So I wrote from the field to Meyer Fortis saying that I intended to study the Talensi as migrants to Accra. And he was shocked and appalled by this. He told me many years later, I had very difficult relations with him after that. And he told me many years later, when I'd finally won his confidence, which took about 10 years, that this was a period in which he was anticipating leaving the chair, and Jack was likely to be his successor. And Meyer had built up social anthropology to be a powerhouse at Cambridge, but there was a lot of sociology and social and political sciences had just been created, and there was a lot of talk about social anthropology moving in with the other social sciences, or sociology and politics. And Jack was writing articles in New Society saying things like, you know, anthropology is, after all, you know, comparative sociology. And his book, Death, Property and the Ancestors, which came out in '62, was really a kind of manifesto for extending the ethnographic tradition into a wider historical comparative sociology. And he was encouraging his students to study non-traditional ethnographic subjects, local government in Kumasi, entrepreneurs in Accra, teachers in Bongahafo, and so on. And Meyer told me later that he figured that Jack had basically set me up as a kind of fifth column to denigrate his work by recasting it in an unfamiliar light and subversive light, as a means of undermining his heritage when Jack took social anthropology riding off to the sunset into a glorified, extended social science. So I had real difficulties with Meyer all the way through after that. And but of course, being who I was, I mean, that meant that I respected him much more than anybody else, because he gave me a hard time. And I really do feel that Meyer Fortis is, you know, the greatest anthropologist that I've been near.
Really?
Oh yeah, no question of it.
In what way?
Well, first of all, I mean, I knew his fieldwork technique firsthand. I mean, which was astonishing. I mean, his linguistic command was unbelievable. I mean, I spent 2.5 years in the field, including extended periods in the rural areas where he worked. But it was just astonishing, the sheer quantity and quality of what he achieved as an ethnographer. Also, I feel in his two great monographs on the Talensi, the first starts out from a sense of a real struggle with the particularism of social life there. So this is almost unreadable as a book because there are so many names of people and lineages and places. But he really sees society as struggling to achieve a measure of coherence against all the forces for fragmentation, incoherence that Talensi faced. And he's a very strong sense of that. And then in Web of Kinship, he moved towards what I think is his greatest contribution, which is the attempt to marry a kind of statistical and network-oriented approach to kinship to a structural one. I just think this enterprise, in its ethnographic phase in the late 40s, is unsurpassed. I think that after that he simplified his agenda progressively to the point where I couldn't buy into it. But I think his idea, that kinship is life, and that the attempt to build social structures on a foundation of the sheer movement of life is incredibly difficult. And I mean, when he was engaging with that, I mean, his Time and Social Structure essay on Ashanti is an absolutely brilliant example of that approach. And he was, as you probably know, I mean, worked with and trained by Carl Pearson in pioneering statistical methods in I should say that I also was a statistician. I mean, I learned statistics mainly because I was interested in betting, but I used it as my anyway, that's another thing. So Maya also told me something which he may not have told, and this is a good place to place it on the record. He told me that the inspiration for his development cycle approach to kinship was Darcy Thompson's Growth and Form. And if you know that book, I mean, it's a brilliant book. It's an anti-Mendelian kind of genetics in which he's saying, look, I mean, we all know what the flowers look like. I mean, there is a form. How does it get that with all this Darwinian variation? And it becomes, in fact, a very powerful metaphor for Maya's work in that, I think, his most creative late 1940s phase, when he was at Oxford, before he came to Cambridge, when he formed the Gang of Three with Radcliffe Brown and the EP at Oxford, when Max was a kind of fellow traveller, and when he was instrumental in setting up the ASA. I mean, he was, I think, a trade union organizer, Monkey. I mean, I remember when I was teaching in America, he came back. I came back and he offered to give me, to put me on a talk, and he said, of course we'll pay you a fee. And I said, you don't have to do that. I mean, I'll do it, without a fee. And he said, oh God, you working class aristocrats really get up my nose. I mean, he said, when I came to Cambridge, they never paid us for anything. I had to fight to get us to be paid to do all these things around the university. And of course, as you know, he fought to get the colleges to extend the range of fellowships available to lecturers in anthropology. And so he was very much, and he also came up with the slogan, social anthropology is what social anthropologists do. This is becoming rambling, but but I mean, Maya, and I ought to say that Maya and EP, I didn't know EP closely, but they seemed to both of them have the attitude, at least by the time I ran into them, that it was impossible to talk to people like us. There was no point in trying to engage us intellectually because we all had our prejudices, So Maya would come up with paternalistic things like, you young people are all interested in change. What matters is continuity, But of course you're not interested in that, you just want to kind of scrap the world. And AP, I saw on several occasions, basically pretending, I think, to be Gaga, as a way of not having to engage with his interlocutors, who were kind of, wanted a slice of the great man, and he just wanted out of it. So, where was that going?
Well, can we date this? This is
well, I mean, did 4 years as an undergraduate, half of it in classics, between 1961 and 65. I spent from 65 to early 68 in the field, and then I wrote up my PhD in a year and a half from, and I got it in September 69, and I took a job immediately.
Can we just touch on one thing before we get to the fieldwork, and that is, you mentioned the tension between Jack and Maya.
Yeah.
The more famous tension at that time was between Maya and Edmund.
Yeah.
Are there any comments? This is often airbrushed out, but what was the great dispute about in Cambridge between Maya and Edmund, do you think?
Well, the dispute between Maya and Edmund was a bit old hat by the time I came in. For people like me and Johnny Parry, it was were we in Jack's camp and going to Africa, or in Edmund's camp and going to South Asia? As I say, there were very lively methodological arguments about where anthropology might go that pitched Jack against Edmund more than Edmund against Maya. I have my own views on that. As a graduate student, it became clear to me that our seminars were basically a grandstanding event in which these individuals basically got at each other, and it wasn't just Maya. In fact, by then, the thing between Edmund and Maya had got to very petty college politics levels, like whether Maya being denied a room after he retired and things like that. And I felt, I didn't know Edmund very well, but I did get on with him. I have to tell you this anecdote, because he once said to me, he said, "Do you think you're unusual here, Keith?" And I said, yeah. And he said, "Well, you're not." He said, "I'm unusual." He says, "You don't think that the aristocracy and the high bourgeoisie have got the brains between them to keep a place like Cambridge going, do you?" He said, "They have to scour the country for the bright, provincial lower class kids to keep the place going. But we have a system whereby we socialize them as soon as they come into behaving eventually and speaking like the high bourgeoisie or the London kind of ruling class, and imitating the symbolism of that class." But he says, all the people here, most of them, come from the same background as you do. He says, "I'm different because I was rich and powerful to start with." Anyway, so I got on very well with Edmund. But I was very disappointed with the level of discussion in the seminar, which it seemed to me, on the one hand, was a kind of personalized bickering, but on the other hand, was never pushed to a truly rational discursive level, but was always kind of being dissipated into ethnographic anecdotes. And I complained once about this, and Maya said to me, he says, "The trouble with you, Keith, is that you're too rational." He says, "Anthropology is not a rational discipline." This is from the guy who I came to think of as eventually, as the profoundest intellectual that I encountered. And I should say that the revelation, it was building over years, but there was one day in mid-70s when I was already launched in my American career, and I was having coffee in King's, and the conversation had gone the way it always did, which was nowhere. And we just were discussing something casual. I've forgotten what it was, but I remember the moment when I dropped through the trap door. And he says, "What do you mean by time?" I'd used time in the previous sentence. He said, "Tell me what you think time is." And immediately I was kind of swimming out of control. And he chose at that moment to treat me like a real intellectual. It's like it took him 10 years. But eventually he decided I was serious enough to engage with at his own level, which of course if he'd known, perhaps he did, as an old kind of patriarch, was just the kind of technique to hook me.
Okay, well, let's get to your fieldwork.
Mm-hmm.
Can you remember the iconic moment when you first arrived and your impressions?
Yes, I can, because Jack and Esther Goody were in Bole in Gonja when I came, and I was supposed to rendezvous with them first. So I had to get a bus to northwestern Ghana first, and this was notable for the fact that the bus driver had a girlfriend at a particular ferry, and we spent the night there being eaten by mosquitoes and trying to get to sleep in a bus with no protection against the heat or anything else. And then I arrived in Bole, and I went out I walked to the place where they were staying, and I found Jack and Esther. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I found them asleep, naked, in the shower. I mean, I went into the house, hello, anybody home? And they were lying in a thin kind of pool of water, naked, and having their siesta. That's about as primal a scene as you get. And then after that, I decided to go to, well, there was one other anecdote I have to tell you about. Jack said, if you're going to work in Zongos, with strangers, you've got to go and stay in the Bole Zongo, which is the strangers' quarters. And he fixed up with a Dagati sergeant called Sergeant Gadu for me to spend a few days there. So I went there with my safari camp bed and mosquito net and found a place. Now, the only reason white men ever went to this area was for sex. And the only single woman in the place was the sergeant's sister, who was fit, fat, and 40, and a trader. And so she started giving me the eye. And I didn't quite figure it out until one night she came into my room when I was asleep, naked. And
you were naked or she was naked?
I was naked. I was under my mosquito net on my safari bed in this. And she came in, basically to consummate our implicit liaison. And I kind of screamed or showed sort of extreme anxiety and terror, and she disappeared, but she left a gift. And in the morning, I found that she left a pawpaw, which of course is a sexual symbol. I mean, you slice it and the inside is, guess what, And so I decided, the least I could do was eat it for breakfast. And I opened it up, and the inside was seething with maggots. So
it might not have worked. What were you working on? What was your thesis?
Well, I got my grant to study. At that time, everybody was influenced by the work of Little and Banton in Sierra Leone on voluntary associations and the new states. I mean, Wallerstein had written about this and so on. So I was actually going out there to do a political study of migrants, citizenship, voluntary associations, the usual story, the new states. That was my line. But when I got there, I found it was a one-party state. There wasn't any actual sort of politics on the ground. Everybody was bored. There wasn't anything to study. But I came to live in a slum, and I noticed that everybody was moving something on the street, from marijuana to refrigerators. And I decided to study that.
At what point did you come up with one of your famous series about the informal economy? Was it early on?
No, well, it was, after I wrote my thesis on entrepreneurs. So I approached the problem initially through individuals. And most of my, when I gave papers in the graduate seminar, they were basically life stories and things like that. So I took a kind of biographical approach to entrepreneurship. But after getting my PhD, I took a job at East Anglia in a development studies outfit, because I decided that I wanted to know more about states and international history and development, and And so I made that move. And
was Michael Mann there then?
no, he was in Essex later. He married my wife, stole my wife. But but I started talking to development economists, and I got the idea that they were all talking about the threat of urban unemployment in the third world. And I said, well, these people are not unemployed. I mean, they're working frantically around the clock, but they're not getting very much for it, and it's very... and so I came up with the idea of an informal economy at a conference in Sussex in 1971, a couple of years after so that's where the informal economy idea came from.
Can you, sometimes with these ideas, there's a moment when you suddenly clicks. I heard Mark Elvin describing when he, in a coffee session, he came up with the idea of high-level equilibrium in China. Was there a moment when you suddenly thought this explains a great deal?
No, quite the opposite, in fact. I mean, my aim was to translate my ethnographic experience into a language that the economists could understand and use. And I was successful in that, but I did not aim to create a concept. It was they, the economists, in taking it up for the ILO, the World Bank and so on, who turned it into a concept. And at the very same time that I came up with this concept, I converted to Marxism. And of course the Marxists hated it. And so, you know, Peter Worsley, who's professor of sociology at Manchester, where I was at the time, said, look, I'm on the board at Penguin, why don't you put together a reader on the informal economy and establish it as your idea? You may never come up with a better one. And I said, well, if I don't come up with a better idea than this, I'm going to quit now. So I went into denial about the significance of the informal economy for at least 15 years, and then surfaced again in the late 80s and realized it was still around. People were still quoting me as having authored it in some way. And I thought, well, you know, I might as well move in and get some cultural capital out of it. So ever since then, I kind of write these magisterial reviews, one of which, in fact, I gave last week at the World Bank in Washington.
That's an interesting story. So, how long were you at East Anglia?
Just 2 years.
2 years.
And then I went to Manchester.
Manchester, was Max still there?
Yeah, Max was still there when I went, and he died in Israel while I was there. He died in I went in 71 to 5, and he died in 73.
What did you think of Max?
I thought he was a blustering bully.
Intelligent as well?
Oh yeah, obviously. But at that time, I mean, Emrys Peters had more or less taken over the department and had tended to marginalize Max. And Max spent as much time as he could away, mostly in Israel. So I really had very little to do with Max. All I can say is that at one stage, this is the anecdote that stays in my mind. This was the time when Critique of Anthropology was being launched by some students at University College London, Joel Kahn, Jonathan Friedman, and so on. And then one time when I was in London, they said, you know, they wanted Jack Goody and Max Gluckman to be the kind of ancestors that was, you know, the symbolic sponsors of their rag. And because they considered Max and Jack to be the two anthropologists of the senior generation who they felt had most engaged with the question of political transformation, you know, which they wanted anthropology to be. So I went to Max, and they asked me to approach these two people, Jack because he was my teacher, Max because I was at Manchester. I went to see Max, and he just blew a gasket. He said, you people, all you want to do is denigrate the work of me and my generation. He went on for 5 minutes about Bob Schulte in Netherlands, you know, writing these scurrilous things. I said, Max, they want to honor you. They really think you're the bee's knees. What is all this? But he didn't want to hear it. I mean, he just went on into a rant, and of course he died. He blew a gasket on a parking ticket in Tel Aviv.
Really?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, he got a parking ticket and went...
I didn't know that. Peter Worsley, I mean, in some ways, I did a very interesting interview with him, and there are some similarities, the Manchester background and Marxism and so on. How did you get on with Peter?
I do get on with Peter very well. In fact, I wrote the entry in the Dictionary of Anthropological Biography that was published by Routledge quite recently. I got on with Peter very well. I mean, Peter has a kind of social anthropologist mentality that he got from an early age, but which he had to drop more or less because he was refused the chance to work as a social anthropologist, first in Africa and then in New Guinea. But it comes out in his later book, which probably very few people know, called Knowledges, in which he tries to pull together his own kind of version of cognitive anthropology. I was very much impressed by and influenced by The Trumpet Shall Sound, his Cargo Cults book, when I was an undergraduate. It was the first book I read that really lit me up. And of course he's a Manchester United supporter, so what more can I say? I mean, Peter is I think his career, yes, I would be honored to think that my career had echoes of his. But I mean, the thing about Peter, unlike me, is he's a great institutional leader. I mean, I'm a nomad, and I never sort of settle for very long and tend to be on the margins of institutional power and leadership. And he, you know, he was in on all these things at every possible level.
Well, talking of the nomadism, after Manchester, what did you go on to do?
Well, I went to Yale. I mean, basically what happened at Manchester was that 4 of us were appointed at more or less the same time: David Turton, John Komaroff, Ken Brown, and me. And we formed a clique. We even formed a new residential segment of the Manchester department. We went to Heaton Moor, where nobody else had been before. Previously it was either Didsbury or Cheadle Hulme. And we were very close, and we were all quite confident of our future. And Emrys at one point decided to pull some kind of Syrian dictator technique on us by promoting one of us who ostensibly was the least qualified in terms of publication, David Turton, to senior lecturer. And it did have the effect, because people, you know, I got very upset. I wrote to the Vice-Chancellor saying, this is all corrupt and it's just a political ploy, how can you allow this thing to go on? And I immediately wrote to 4 American departments. Obviously I was not short of chutzpah. I wrote to Yale, Chicago, Harvard and Northwestern and said, I'm on the market. And as it happened, Yale and Chicago took me up, and Yale offered me a job, a tenured job, and so I went.
And who was at Yale at that time?
Oh, it was a very interesting department. The most impressive intellectual there was Floyd Lounsbury, who was a linguist who, as he once told me, only published 13 articles in his life, but he was proud to say that he would not, even at this point, want to change a word of any of them. And when I went there, I had to talk to all the full professors individually, and Floyd didn't know what to talk to me about. It was a bit like the E.P. Fortis story before. And so he just took me into a side office of his and showed me the Palenque hieroglyphs that he had done more than anyone to decipher, but had been, again, because he was a perfectionist, he was upstaged by some Russian or other who got the kind of credit for it. But he, you know, he just you know, let me show you my etchings, kind of thing. The Palenque scroll, you know, and so Floyd was a quiet but deeply. I mean, I was very impressed by the professionalism of these American scholars. I mean, Hal Conklin and Harold Scheffler, a whole bunch of them, not just, it was a mixed department, archaeologists. David Pilbeam was there, Alison Richard, who has been a lifetime friend since then, was an assistant professor in primatology.
Now Vice Chancellor of Cambridge.
Yes, indeed. In fact, thanks to our long-term friendship, when I visit Cambridge now, I sleep in the Duke of Edinburgh's bedroom, which he very rarely uses. But no, I was impressed by their sheer literacy. I mean, it made me realize that I'd been brought up in an oral culture where being a smart person with the mouth was really what counts at high table, in tutorials. I mean, just being quick. And there, you know, I mean, these people had massive numbers of filing cabinets and knew so much more. I mean, I was truly impressed by that. I mean, Hal Scheffler was, you know, amazing, his knowledge. And he and Lounsbury collaborated on the study of kinship. I mean, Hal Conklin was a chronic non-producer, but I mean, his mastery of this kind of ethnobotany, cultural ecology stuff was amazing, amazing. I mean, these were guys who were in for the longue durée, you know. I was deeply impressed by that.
What did you teach?
I taught anthropology and political economy. I taught Africa. I even one term taught, and this is part of the American dream, if you like. They were short of courses in archaeology for graduate students, and I put one on the transition from bronze to iron in the Eastern Mediterranean from 1600 to 500 BC. And I had, you know, classical archaeologists, Assyriologists, anthropological archaeologists, and I just divided up the territory. You get Italy, you get Anatolia, you get Egypt, you know. And the idea was to look at the historical sources and the archaeological sources and seek to explain the discrepancies which are almost universal in terms of the chronology between the historical and archaeological sources, but also to see if by placing, I mean, it was very much a balkanized research area, and I developed a kind of, we had a kind of chart with all these different places put on it and the time scale down the side, and tried to see if we could sort of work out some of the correspondences across, you know, specialities in Hittites or, you know, pre-Roman Italians or whatever. And it was a marvelous experience. And I mean, I could get away with it because I could pretend to be a classicist.
Why did you ever leave such a wonderful place?
Well, my life disintegrated. I took. I was there for 4 years. I mean, I had tenure, as I say, but my marriage broke up after I arrived, and I then had not one but 2 mental breakdowns, in the course of which I resigned. And I mean, you know, the fact is that from being a Manchester Grammar School boy, you know, from the age of 10, as it were, I mean, I had never stopped until, you know, and then suddenly in my mid-30s, I hit the brick wall at the end of the railway track that I was on. And my life disintegrated, literally. And I was then put into a nomadic situation in which I went to Michigan, McGill, Chicago on 1-year contracts, always with the idea that they might, you know, appoint me on a longer term basis, but I kept having mental breakdowns while I was there. So it was very difficult for them to go through with it.
You've got fantastic references. I remember reading them when you came to Cambridge from people like Marshall Salin.
And Skip Rappaport.
Yeah, fantastic. And the most brilliant person they've ever met and all this kind of stuff. So it was a pity that none of them...
The place that I would have liked to make my life was Michigan.
Was it?
Yeah, because places like Yale and Harvard and Stanford and Chicago all have this idea of, you know, you've got to be the smartest kid on the block and you've got to demonstrate it every day. But Michigan was a very large, but it was a land-grant university. It was very prestigious. It had one of the biggest libraries in the United States. I mean, anthropology, political science, history were, you know, number one or whatever in the States. But it was a Midwestern society. It was very democratic. There was no class, and there was very little overt competition within. You know, and they called itself the Athens of the Midwest, which is kind of an exaggeration. But I really loved Ann Arbor, and I loved Detroit for the Arab food and the rock concerts and the jazz. And it's only 40 miles down the. You know, I felt that. You know, I mean, Ann Arbor was the place where the German technique of teaching through seminars was pioneered in America. And that kind of very American ethos of letting everybody have their say, nobody pulls rank, there's no kind of authoritarian structure here. I mean, it's really, to my mind, you know, it seemed that it could only have taken root in something like Midwestern democratic populist society. And the university had this kind of intellectual excellence and that ethos. And I would have loved to have spent my life there, actually.
Was that the last place you were at?
No, the last place I was at was Chicago. And I mean, there was one day in Chicago when, you know, I was feeling particularly depressed and the wind was whistling up my arse in the middle of the winter. And I suddenly realized that there wasn't anyone within 1,500 miles who had a clue about who I was. And I mean, the reason I left Britain, I told myself, was that I found it suffocating. Nobody really gave me credit for what I was capable of. The Americans said, okay, big boy, you know, take it where you want to go. I mean, they're very good at that. It's, you know, but there isn't any support network there. And I kind of crashed and there was nobody there, really. I mean, Skip Rappaport is my deep friend, but generally speaking, there's no safety net there. So that after, you know, spending 8 years wandering, as it were, and suffering quite a lot, I have to say, I mean, in terms of this mental illness. I mean, I had about over the years, 8 or 9 psychotic episodes involving being sectioned into and every time it involves wipeout and having to rebuild your life. I mean, because manics do all kinds of things to get rid of their life. So, you know, I suddenly realized that I couldn't survive in America because there wasn't the social cushioning that I needed. So, and then the very thing which seemed to me originally to be suffocating now seemed quite attractive, to come back to Britain.
So it's a pleasure to continue an interview begun a little while ago with Keith Hart. Keith, we got to the point where you decided that you didn't want to stay in America for various reasons, or you did want to come back to England. 1983 was it, I think?
Yes, it was it was late, you know, summer, fall '83, and I'd been in the United States for 8 years and had taken up a rather nomadic existence, and I was getting fed up with it, and so I decided I wanted to come home, and I was much influenced in my pretentious way by a quote of Hazlitt, who said, if a man would fulfill his destiny, he must go home. And which I understood as being that really permanent emigration is not an answer, because you have to test yourself against the conditions of your own formation in maturity. That's how I understood it. But then the question was, which was home? I mean, and was it Manchester, you know, where I'd spent all my youth? Or was it Cambridge, where I'd spent as many years in my adult life? And I decided in the end that I was an intellectual more than a Manchester United supporter. So I came back to Cambridge. I had no job, or the only means of support I had was my gambling stake, which I always had for periods of unemployment. And I came and lived on the Bedford Road for a year, supporting myself and living a rather anomic life. And then a job of for an assistant anthropologist, assistant lecturer in social anthropology came up, and I didn't think about it at all. But I remember meeting a guy called Parker Shipton on the street, and he said, "Why don't you apply for it?" And I said, "What? Me?" And then I thought about it, and I said, "Why not? You know, I'm big enough, you know, to take the humiliation." But I wasn't, as it turned out. But that's another part of the story. So I applied for it, and Jack Goody was head of department, coming towards the end of his period, and he didn't like the idea of me applying for it at all. I mean, he, as you know, he had a principle, I suppose you could call it, that these positions, 3-year untenured positions, ought to rotate as and not be converted into permanent employment, although that's what happened to him. And he had his own candidates, young people, and of course we'd just gone through you had just gone through that rather traumatic phase in which Michel Verdun, Sue Benson and Paul Jorion were essentially sacked, although at least one or more of them had quite solid claims for being continued. So it was all a very kind of political thing, and but I put in for it. I mean, I thought, you know, actually I want to teach, and this is the only job that's coming up. In fact, Marilyn Strathern was another applicant for the same job.
It was roughly in the field of economic anthropology.
No, it was. I don't think there was any. Was it?
Well, if that's the one that you got, then it was. There
were 2 jobs, and Jack's candidates were Chris Hahn and Paul St. Cassian. It may be that there was an economic slant to it, and each of those would have been able to claim that they had it. Anyway, so I applied for it, and Chris and I were actually offered the jobs.
And it was just at the turnover, because Ernest Gellner was at the appointment.
That's right. Ernest Gellner had already been appointed as Jack's successor, and he was at the interview. It's funny, I mean, Jack said to me afterwards, he says, "It's only because of Ernest that you got that job. Because you were like a zombie. It was like you were on Valium in the interview. It was just an appalling interview." And I kind of believed that for the next, I don't know how many years, 20 years, until Gilbert Lewis, our dear colleague, once said to me, "You know, you did such a great interview. You know, you had to be given the job." So whatever Jack's, I know what Jack's motives were. He was trying to make me a client of Ernest's, but.
Well, what I remember of it, just to throw the last bit in the pool, was that you got these absolutely stellar references from very, very distinguished American anthropologists who said you were the best thing they'd ever met, and how wonderful you were. So that also swayed it.
But I was, I thought it didn't matter. I mean, that I was untenured and very low ranking. You know, I'd had a tenured professorship at Yale when I was 32. I was now 41 and entering at the bottom of the ladder. And I thought it didn't matter, but in fact, over the next few years, before I was given tenure, I think it did get to me in various ways. I mean, it wasn't easy inserting myself at that level into the establishment.
Did you come and join a college, or?
I didn't have a college fellowship at that time.
You've been at St John's, haven't you?
St John's was my college, and as an undergraduate and graduate student, and in fact I had many friends there, like Peter Clark and Jack and Gilbert. So I used to just go into St John's, and you know, we were an identifiable clique. People used to organise their seating plans according to be near us or away from us. But I think we had the reputation of being more entertaining than most of the people on St John's High Table.
But did you teach? Did you become a director of studies for?
I think I was director of studies at Pembroke for a while.
And later at Girton.
Well, that was afterwards. This is later in the story. It's,
I'll let you tell the story in your.
In '88, you know. But well, I mean, the main feature was my relationship with Ernest, because although we were at such different levels in the system, I think that we had quite a lot in common, as indeed I do with you. I mean, we like big think, social theory, history, and so on. I think he was a bit taken aback to find this unruly 40-something, you know. And also he had a view, which was only partly true, that I was a Marxist, which didn't make me one of his favourite people. But I found him to be quite clumsy in his attempt to sort of make it, you know, he came to me and he says, I want you to be Mr. Development in the department. And I said, I didn't come back to Cambridge to do development. If I wanted to do development, I'd go somewhere serious, you know, who took it seriously. And then he also, I mean, this was really a turning point for the worse in our relationship. As soon as I arrived, I got stuck with being the secretary in the department, and you know that my manners in departmental meetings leave a lot to be desired. And,
abrasive is the word we use.
Abrasive, yes. So Ernest said to me, look, I don't care what you do, just support me. And I said, I can't support you if I think you're wrong. And at that time, I mean, I felt as a Cambridge insider that Ernest really didn't understand the politics of Cambridge. I mean, he'd been really adapted to LSE, which is a very different structure and bureaucracy and political system. And he always had this view, wouldn't it be nice if we could, you know, just leave it to a few, you know, mandarins to sort things out, and why do we have to do all this tomfool politics in the corridors and, you know, greasing people? I mean, he hated it really and didn't understand it. And this was a period when Giddens was running what I call, you know, his Polish campaign. I mean, Giddens had taken over social and political sciences, and I believe that social anthropology was his Poland. I mean, his Russia was the economics department, where there were so many sociologists embedded in this old structure of economics and politics and so on. But his first thing was to kind of right the historical wrong that had led to the appointment of John Barnes, an anthropologist, rather than David Lockwood as the founding chair of the sociology department. So his line was basically to create a following amongst all the sociologists scattered around Cambridge. And one of the ways to do it was basically to target social anthropology, which was easier now that you know, Jack, who was a very good academic politician and had very strong relations with that. Anyway, so although Ernest was temperamentally, intellectually, you know, probably the best person you could ever have in you know, as the head of our department for building relations with SPS, there was this particular moment of consolidation, and we were in the same building, and the building, of course, was going through its periodic epidemiological upheavals. And I just felt, you know, I just had this sense that we were being headed by somebody who didn't know what was going on.
Mm.
And I was not, and of course, as a junior and recent addition to the place, I was not in a good position so I felt this tension between my political insight and my lowly status.
Mm. So you were feeling quite anxious and frustrated, basically.
Well, this period from 83 to 86, when I went off to Jamaica for 2 years, that was, I now think, the worst period in my life.
Mm.
I mean, I was suffering from a long-term mental illness, and I felt terribly hurt and humiliated by what had happened in America, by the loss of my family life, by having at my age to sort of scramble for position at the bottom of the pile. And I now realize, and didn't then, that I felt very bitter, angry, because my mental condition made it very difficult for me to work in a sustained way. So, and in fact, I was worried that I wouldn't be writing enough, because I couldn't maintain concentration for more than an hour at a time. And it was then that I also decided that I was worried that I went out for not publishing enough. And so I thought, well, what can I do, you know, to make sure that I get kept on? And so I thought, well, if I turn myself into a great teacher, then the students might go to the barricades on my behalf. Yeah. So I actually put quite a lot of effort into thinking about my teaching techniques and style and so on. And I also put probably an unhealthy amount of energy into the sociology and politics of academic life. I mean, I couldn't work at home. I really couldn't concentrate, and so I would just leave home in the morning and just kind of bat around the seminars and committee meetings and gossip and the rest of it. And to some extent, it got me through this really rather terrible period. But it was also very frustrating as a personal level. I mean, I wasn't sure that I would ever again have the means of doing the sustained written work that I knew that I was capable of, and I felt this illness prevented me from fulfilling.
You mentioned putting a lot of energy into teaching. I obviously knew that your lectures were brilliant, but also that they're very stressful, because you basically stood there and talked for an hour. I don't know how you plan them or whether you have notes or not, but I noticed the same thing with the one lecture on YouTube where a student suddenly comes in across the camera, and someone has commented on YouTube that you get very angry, which you used to do with our students when they came in late. And that was presumably because you were concentrating so hard that any interruption made it very difficult to go on. But could you talk about how you actually lecture? Because you are a very good lecturer.
This was a bit later, but I think it's right to talk about it now. Sometime around the late 80s, early 90s, the very first time that I lectured for a living was my first job at East Anglia. And I decided, and it was on Marx and Weber and development or something like that, and I decided to ad lib. And I kind of ground to a halt after 15 minutes. And then I said, look, I'm sorry, I can't go on. And, any questions? And the regulation American graduate student asked the question, and I kind of staggered on for 4 minutes, and then I stopped and I cancelled the lecture and wrote them out for the next 20 years. I mean, I was so traumatized by the experience. But obviously the fact that I did that meant that I had this aspiration to improvise. And so at some stage, I decided that I would train myself to improvise my lectures. And of course, the big thing you've got to train against is fear of failure. So what I did was, I gradually reduced the amount of time that I had to prepare. So if it took normally 3 hours to prepare a written lecture, I would give myself 2 hours, and then an hour, and then half an hour. And this process of training myself took about 1.5 years, because the fear of failure is very, very great. Because what's at stake is learning to trust your unconscious mind and your own training and the way your thought is actually organized unconsciously, as opposed to being sort of dependent on a script that's out there already. And so basically, I had to. So and then I would get to the point where I would just make a list of points, of 5 or 6 points, and lecture to that. And then I got rid of all written aids, and then I would prepare my lecture on the walk to the lecture room, 15 minutes or whatever it was. And finally I reached this point where I realized that the only 2 things that count are what is the big idea of the lecture and where are you going to start. Because once you start improvising, you're on a wave. It's a wave motion. And everything that you have already said and might say is going through your mind. It's almost like a split screen. I can only speak of myself. That there are so many different levels of this thing going on, including seeing what people in the audience are doing, and so on and so forth. But really, you're on a wave, and you just can't get off. You can't get off the wave and look and this, So, so what I realized was that what matters is where do you start. And once you're on, and you need to know what the big idea is. But once you're moving, there's nothing else you can do. And you really do have to trust the unconscious mind. And so in the end, I would go to Mill Lane, for part 1 lectures, and I would wait until I was standing on the podium, and there's all that energy in the room, all the kids yakking away, and the whole point about this improvised lecture thing is drawing on the energy of the audience to sort of feed yourself and then give it back to them. So what I would do is I would just I would stand there, and then I would, through my body language, make it clear that I wanted to start, and some people would stop and some people would carry on yakking, and in the end there'd be just one kind of deviant at the back who hadn't noticed, and I would kind of put the beady eye on him. But in this process I would think of possible starting things, like, am I going to use this thing I read in The Guardian over breakfast, or am I going to use something I just noticed those 2 were doing with each other, or something concrete, or something. So I would 3 or 4 launching possibilities would enter my mind, and then I would start. And once I start, it becomes kind of asymptotic. I know when I've got to finish. I had this thing, I'll start after 5 minutes, it's an hour, but I'll start after 5 minutes, and I'll finish 5 minutes early, so you can get to A.J.P. Taylor used to do this. He used to say, I will finish on the stroke, the first stroke of 10 o'clock by St. Anne's Church, and he would, he would give this incredibly, and he would end up, and he'd come with what seems like a rhetorical flourish, and he would stop, and the thing would go bong, and all the kids think, and C.L.R. James used to do this also. He used to say, I shall speak for precisely 45 minutes. What happens is, when you start on this wave, you've got lots of room. You know, you've got to maintain a fairly tight link to the audience. You can't afford to let it get too lax. But you do have a lot of room in the first 15 minutes, you know, to sort of experiment with the rhythm and the pace of it all. But as you start getting after the halfway mark and getting closer, and it's like an asymptotic ending in which, you know, you've got 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, and what I discovered was that the discoveries that I made by this method always came at the end, when I mean, because I like Beethoven endings. I like it to feel like it's a climax, that it was always intended to end this way. But of course, I discovered the ending in this process of coming into the conclusion and wondering how the hell I'm going to wrap it up in the time available, and not knowing quite. But so anyway, that all of this, you know, something that I taught myself, and you know, I was tremendously afraid, as anybody is. But in the end, I mean, I discovered that if I relied on you know, what I trained myself to be, it came out very well organized. And in fact, students often said to me that their, you know, notes on my lectures were often more clearly structured than by people who had actually produced an outline. And what that means is that, you know, after all these years of going to Manchester Grammar School and being a classicist and a professional analytical social scientist and the rest of it, I mean, you know, my unconscious mind is highly disciplined, and it's like, you know, I was a classical musician who decided to become a jazz player. I mean, you can, you know, a trained classical musician can play jazz, but the jazz that he plays is not John Coltrane. I mean, it's something formed by this very heavy training.
That's fascinating. One of the four people who I know who do this kind of thing very well, one was Giddens himself,
Yeah.
one was Keith Hopkins, another was Ernest. And I wondered, from Ernest's experience, because I used to ask him to come and lecture, he used to write to me afterwards and say, I didn't have notes, I think I said some interesting things. Could you find some students who took notes on my lectures so that I could use their notes to help me? So after a couple of times I used to tape record them. Did you ever feel, if you were discovering new things, I mean, did they remain in your memory, or did you write them down afterwards?
No, I mean, this is the thing. This method is the enemy of memory. I never know what I've said. I only know the feeling of it. I mean, because, you know, you know, this is, it's. That's why I encourage people to take my lectures now, because and even video them.
Have you ever asked them to?
Well, usually, you know, in recent years, somebody will come up to me and say, "Do you mind if I tape record?" And I say, "Not at all. Please do." No, it's.
But you've never used the tape recordings or the notes to write.
No, because I actually don't think the. I mean, I like having a record of my performances, if you like, one or two or three. But actually, the point of this method is not getting it right. It's, I mean, what I felt was that, I mean, there's a story about Marcel Mauss in the Institute of Ethnology in the 1930s, where all the leading intellectuals and artists of Paris used to come along, you know, and it was a great event, and he gave lectures that people liked very much, but nobody could remember what they were about. And three surrealists, including Bataille and Breton, decided to do an experiment on these lectures, and to see if they were in fact they did in fact take different notes, and they all took different notes. So they then confronted the guy and they said, what's all this about? I mean, we like your lectures, but what are the lectures about? And most said, it was never my intention to impose my thoughts on yours. I thought the point of these lectures was to help you to discover your own. And what I felt I was doing by making a live performance, if you like, rather than reading in a rather dispassionate way, was that I was showing these students that ideas can be part of life. I mean, there's a lot of the way that we experience ideas through reading dead books and so on, which give the opposite impression. So I felt that what I was doing, I'm walking around the stage, waving my hands, this little man bouncing up and down, sounding enthusiastic, and at the same time, there's a sort of coherence. So what I felt was more important than whatever they got in particular from the lectures was the sense that they might have of enthusiasm for the ideas. What I said you can lecture for knowledge and you can lecture for belief. And I lecture for belief. I want the student to go rushing out of the lecture room to buy the book I've been talking about. And I'm less concerned about what it is that I actually got across, as long as I can produce that effect. For some of them, I was aware also that, it only happens to a few. So, but I wrote something I rather like about Ernest in his Festschrift. There was a Cambridge Anthropology Festschrift which was keyed off his posthumous book of essays on politics and anthropology, which has Turner's The Grove at Nemi, the Golden Bough, on the cover, and I called it The Bard with the Killer Touch, because the theme of how Malinowski assassinated Fraser was part of the thing, but what I saw, I felt that Ernest and I had something very profoundly in common in the way we used oral memory to think. And I think that's, for me, because that's a point in common that I had with him, that was one of the most striking things about him, I thought, was that, is he a philosopher, is he an anthropologist, is he a sociologist? The main thing is, he composed his books, with a dictaphone, his feet on the table, staring at the gap between the ceiling and the wall, and he lectured in the same way. And for me, I guess what happened after Cambridge is that I took this method and applied it to writing. I wanted to learn to write using the same method.
Where I was going to go on to is exactly the link you were making with writing, because I found a great shift in my writing from kind of PhD writing, where you appear to start from the facts and work upwards, and you plan everything very, very carefully, to a kind of much looser style where you, as the man said, you think first, and you write first and you think later.
Are you recording this?
Yeah. So you write first, think later. And I remember you jokingly saying, well, I write it first and then I put in the footnotes later to support the argument, or something like that. But basically, could you say a little more about how you write?
Yeah, well, I always believed that that I reflect first, speak second, and write third, and that ideally a lot of what I write is something that I've spoken about a lot already, and that's another reason for adopting this improvised lecturing thing, because it's by talking these things through in this way, I often discover the kind of logic of how it fits together, as well as some kind of powerful anecdote that had not presented itself to me before. And I liked doing supervisions at Cambridge on the same topic, if I'm Mr. Economic Anthropology, then I get to do most the gift with a whole stream of students coming through my door, and by the end of the term, I may have discovered something about Mose by talking about him so many times that I hadn't figured out before. So but when I left Cambridge in the 90s to go to Paris, it was very much to get away from this kind of engaged, very social and performative style of intellectual life, and lock myself up in an attic and start doing a lot more writing. But the method of writing that I used was, I mean, I don't work from notes. I often, there are two parts of it, and the more writing that I've done, the less significant is the first part. The first part is getting text out from scratch. But for me, increasingly, writing is reworking text. And now, because of word processing and so on, if I'm going to write an essay on Kant, I mean, I'll start off by just accumulating everything that I've written on Kant in other contexts, and make a file maybe of 50 pages, and then start using that as a resource, so that I very rarely now write anything from scratch, but usually have something that I've already written on the topic to work with. But then, you know, for me, I think the big problem is how can you remain interested in something you've been working on for 30 or 40 years? I mean, that's the big problem. And for me, the beauty of it, I mean, I'm really grateful for this, and there was no reason why it should be so, but I'm infatuated with my own prose. And I never lose interest in my own words. And so if I'm, you know, lacking inspiration, I can just go back to some part of what I'm writing that I've already written and start tinkering with it. And in the process of tinkering, you know, changing a semicolon into a colon, just moving one word from here to there in the sentence, you know, just working with the mechanics of the language somehow gets me back into it in a new way. And so I can constantly renew my engagement with my old ideas. I mean, people say to me that most of my ideas they've known for 50 years, you know, that I'm extremely consistent in what I say and how I say it. But for me, you know, it all feels new all the time, even though it's old. And I think, you know, that's my favorite screenwriter. Oh God, I've forgotten his name now. the guy who wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I've forgotten his name.
We'll come back to him.
It'll come back. But I mean, he says, you know, there are only 12 stories, and if you don't give the audience one of these stories, they'll kill you. But the key to it is to tell them this old story in a way that they feel they've never heard before or seen before. And so this is I think, a very deep truth that my method of writing is very much tapping into. I don't mind at all whether what I'm writing is unoriginal to me or indeed to the world, because every time it's written, even if it's you know, proofreading in an extremely technical sense, it's always something new. And that dialectic of the old and the new, and for me, the fact that it's anchored in oral memory, that the memory is itself oral. I mean, I think you have this quality too, but you're also a trained historian, and you know you necessarily have to work with massive amounts of external sources. And I never work like that. I can't work like that anymore. There was a time, as you say, with the PhD when I, you know, worked that way. You know, how you got your field notes, you've got to use your field notes and so on. But I mean, for years now, I mean, you know, I only write about things that I know at the same level that I know what I lecture about, which is things that I've been thinking about for years and years and years, and that may be renewed by a little bit of novelty here or there. But for me, I think this is one of the reasons why I hate the notion of intellectual property, and this drive in the academic universe to tell every little shit that he's supposed to own something completely original that nobody thought of before. I mean, I don't see that at all. I think I'm part of a great conversation about the world and making a better society that's been going on for thousands of years. I'm a classicist. I read the people who made the big difference. I learn from them. I put my oar in. It may be significant, it may not. Who cares? I don't know. It's not going to be up to me. But mainly I see myself as part of this ongoing human conversation, in which nothing is new. And so, I get very upset about this idea of accumulating private property and ideas.
We could either go back to your life or just pursue one further thing. I often ask people just to describe one bit of their intellectual life, one of their books or one of their articles. We talked earlier about the informal economy and so on, but one of your more recent books is The Memory Bank. Could you just sort of synthesize that and say how you came to write it and what it says?
Yeah. Well, it came at the point where I left Cambridge to go and live in Paris, which was a deinstitutionalization. I knew that I wasn't going to have a job in France. I did in fact find ways of garnering academic income from Britain while living in Paris, but it was also with the view to it was with a view to putting much more effort into writing. I remember I organised a conference in Cambridge on the Torres Straits expedition, and at the dinner, John Davies was sitting next to me, and he says, "Why are you going to Paris? What are you going to do there?" And I said, "I'm going to write." And he says, "What are you going to do? What do you want to write for?" And I said, "Well, I want people who didn't have the privilege of being in the same room as me to know what I think." And he says, "But you don't have to write, Keith. Everybody knows you. We all love you. You've got one of the best networks in the business." So this was the context. I was going to go. What I felt was that I was going to make a transition from academic writing to freelance non-fiction and fiction. And the book that I wanted to write was going to be a kind of homage to my 30 years as a teacher, drawing on the themes that I had lectured about and using the same faculty of memory. So the first version of this was something, I got a contract with Polity to do something called Anthropology and the Modern Economy. And I wrote this thing, and it was supposed to be a textbook, which means that everything in it the students are supposed to be able to go away and write and read about. And when I'd written this text, I hated it, because there was nothing about me in it. And I felt that all that I'd known, I knew a lot about economic life. I'd been a gambler, I had worked for The Economist, I'd been a development consultant, I'd been a publisher, all these things. So I wanted to write something that was more personal. And then I remembered that I'd given a lecture, a Malinowski lecture in 1986 on money, which turned out to be a kind of slow-burning hit. In other words, people kept referring to it. So I thought, well, maybe I've got a line on money. And that was it, really. I decided that I wanted to write a book which had more of me in it, that was retrospective, that drew on all the things I'd lectured about for 30 years and all my research and travel experience. And I thought I would use money as the theme. So then I sat down and asked myself, what is it about us in the late 90s that future generations will be interested in? What are we doing that other people will want to know about us for? And I decided, obviously, you know, in the middle of the dot-com boom, that the thing was the internet was the, and as you know, I mean, it's not something I've been indifferent to for a while. So I then came up with the formula for the book, which is what's happening to money in this internet revolution. And that's what the memory bank is.
You referred to the fact you've been interested in that sort of thing for a long time. I mean,
Well, not as long as you. I mean, you got into it in the early 80s. I mean, I was still discovering, you know, moving from handwritten texts to word processing in the early 80s. I think the time when I got really excited with the digital revolution was with email, which again had existed for a while, but really only took off in the early 90s. And I got very interested in the possibilities of desktop publishing. And I set up with Anna Grimshaw Prickly Pear pamphlets and produced 10 of them in a period of 3 years. And in the course of this, the World Wide Web was invented and began to be disseminated. And I realized that I got onto this revolution at the wrong end through print publication before mastering the potential of online dissemination. So in the course of the mid-90s, I had a number of experiments that I got involved in new patterns of association, the Amateur Anthropological Association and Prickly Pear pamphlets. But more, you know, gradually I began to realize that I had to insert myself into this. I mean, one of the areas in which you and I collaborated in that period was I was chairman of, for a couple of years, of the Council of the Humanities and Social Sciences AVA and IT committee, and we met regularly to look at what the vets were doing and what the criminologists were doing. And you were the anthropology rep, I seem to remember. And we met periodically to review the possibilities for research and teaching in these new technologies. And one of the big questions was, Cambridge is an old place, and why should we be getting involved in this stuff? Because after all, Middlesex Poly has been doing it for a lot longer, and they're more advanced than we are. And I had this view that this revolution was so profound and was moving so fast that it really didn't matter at what point you entered it. Everybody enters it with a series of advantages and drawbacks. And there's no point in saying, well, I'm not an expert, I've not been involved in this for 15 years, because the technologies were becoming more and more user-friendly all the time. And people who weren't stuck with having to do their own computing code in order to participate often discovered possibilities that others hadn't. So that period of the 90s was one in which I really became excited by this thing, and it was the publication of the book that led me to create a website named after the book, initially with the aim of disseminating it and making it accessible in other ways. And so that the end of the 90s was the time in which I published this book and developed this website, which is now one of my key resources, pleasures and investments. But as I say, I defer to you as having seen this a lot earlier. But then again, the uses that you have made of the medium partly reflect the fact that you got in early, and some of the uses that I'm making of it come from getting in later and being under the influence of young geeks who are just looking at some of the fast-breaking possibilities.
Another, I mean, you mentioned being chair of that committee, but you were also, for I don't know how long, director of the African Studies Centre in Cambridge.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about
Yes,
that?
yes. I was director of the African Studies Centre for 6 years, from '92 to '98. I mean, I ought to talk a bit about my relationship with Marilyn Strathern, because I was, I think, the first person to declare for her after Ernest. I mean, I was anyway an early fan and supporter of her merits as a William Wise professor, and I always imagined that she and I had a very good relationship while she was in Manchester, and I took her fellowship at Girton when she left.
Mm.
And we had a correspondence that was really very interesting. I mean, I was saying things like, we must be more overt about our political motives and this and that, and she was saying, well, I'm just a poor woman and I don't understand any of that. But it was very clear that she was a much better politician than I was. So when she came to the, when I thought, she and I might be an item, that we would, because I think we're both very clever, and then we had this history
and
of
modest.
and modest, and so I thought, but in fact she made it fairly clear that she didn't want me messing up the territory at the centre of the department, so she encouraged me to cultivate border activities, liaison with SBS, liaison with the archaeologists and biological anthropologists, which I did as chairman of another committee that reformed the teaching of Part 1. And African Studies was very much part of that. I mean, I remember after I'd been doing it for a few years, I mean, I went into her office and I said, I decided I'm fed up with this, I want to give it up, do something else. And she said, God save me from your enthusiasms. It was the most trenchant put down I've ever had in my life, and I've had a few. So the basic, the basic way it worked out for me and Marilyn was that I was kind of operating in cognate and related areas on the margins, and she was basically running the place. But African Studies was, I gave up my college fellowship because I didn't think that the kind of energy I wanted to put into African Studies was compatible with being a college teaching fellow. And I had a great time. I mean, it was really a very engaging period. I got involved in the war in Angola, in the murder of Ken Saro-Wiwa and Shell in southern in Nigeria. Got involved in Rwanda. South Africa was becoming independent at this time. Everybody expected a bloodbath there. I mean, I organised conferences in which people like Jack Gowon, the former president of Nigeria, were taking part, and I had a policy really, which was that Cambridge has enormous clout in the world, and that the academics are too insular, and so in any of my events that I organised, I always made non-academic constituencies, diplomats, oil executives, soldiers, journalists, and bankers, and so on. And so, I think I made a great success of that, of creating a series of fora in which a very diverse audiences. I I mean, you know, I organized a conference on Angola, which was the first that the two leading antagonistic parties attended anywhere in the 90s. I mean, I got UNITA and the MPLA to come to my conference, even though I'd published a letter in the Independent signed by 100 prominent activists saying that UNITA was a genocidal organization. I also had to deal with the fact that Babangida, the dictator of Nigeria, offered £1.5 million to establish the Miriam Babangida African Women's Research Fellowship. I said, you know, we're not going to touch this money. But the management committee said, take the money, £1.5 million. The Nigerian students were very upset. They said, the whole of Cambridge is built on dirty money. Why are black people dirty money sort of worse than the others? The feminists said, if you don't take this, which is the only fellowship of its kind in the world, you'll be on our hit list for the rest of your life. But the solution came from a Nigerian visiting professor who said to me, look, if you want to get out of this, just say you'd be delighted to take the money, but why are they giving it to Cambridge and not to a Nigerian university? And you would be happy to take the money, but only if there is a comparable effort being made in Nigeria. And that was the last I heard of it. Of course, I mean, later, when Babangida was overthrown and replaced by somebody even worse, Abacha, people were saying, Jesus, thank God we didn't take this money. So that was, I mean, I really enjoyed that phase. You know, I felt it was intellectually very stimulating, but it was also a chance to be political and engage with Africa in that way.
Mm.
And I learned an enormous amount from it.
Mm. But why did you lose your interest in African studies then? It just became routine, or you'd done it long enough, or?
I felt that there was, I mean, you know, my line on African studies was that traditionally Cambridge scholars had treated Africa as an object to be studied. You know, it's the kind of John Lonsdale approach to Africa. You know, we know everything there is to know about Kenya, and that's it. And all the appointments that I made that were within my gift were to Africans, but I always had to fight. You know, they would say, you know, what are you appointing this Nigerian for? He's only going to use it to get off and get a job in the United States, and they ought to be teaching their own people, all this kind of stuff. So my line was, you know, that African studies has to be about our relationship with them. It's about a two-way street between the West and Africa, and it takes in the history of slavery and the Caribbean and all the rest of it. And it's not just about, you know, studying Africa as an object out there. So I was very much committed to developing that side of it, but also I was limited in that, and I was able to promote as my successor Atto Quayson, who was a Ghanaian literary critic. And Atto really took this project of using the African Studies Centre as a resource for Africans to visit and contribute to, and to set up dialogue between Africans and Cambridge scholars and so on. He was in a much better position to do that. I also had aspirations to develop collaborative relations with France on this, but France was becoming very defensive. The French Africanists were becoming very defensive. And when I said to the guy at Bordeaux, which was the leading African Studies Centre. Why don't we kind of collaborate in getting more Africans here? And he says, bloody hell, you know, we can hardly keep our jobs and funding as it is. There's no room for more of them. So I had a feeling that that side of my work, but also, you know, I mean, it was a part of the. It was the most obvious symbol of the fact that I was committing my energies to active political work and social engineering and teaching and so on. And in the middle of the 90s, my mental illness cleared up. I mean, it just cleared up. And it had been there for 20 years. And suddenly I discovered that I had all the powers of concentration that I wanted. And so I was hungry to use my new mental health, as it were, to take up the writing project that I felt had been stalled for quite a long time. I mean, basically, I said that the period after I joined Cambridge department was a very bad time for me, and I got very worried about being around when I had to come up for tenure. I felt that would be very difficult to live with in a concrete way. And Ray Smith from Chicago came up with the offer of a job as a professor in a new school for social sciences in the Caribbean that he had helped to establish. And I wasn't sure how long I could go for, and I went to Ernest and I said it could be anything from 2 months to 2 years, and he said take 2 years. So I took the 2 years, and my promotion to tenure was being decided while I was away. So, and this time in Jamaica was really, I believe, you know, the formation of my kind of mature intellectual life as an anthropologist. Something really profound happened there. I mean, and I felt what it was that I had been raised in Britain. I went to West Africa. I spent the best part of a decade in the United States. And I was always, you know, triangulating these. But there was something about the Caribbean and Jamaica in particular that seemed to synthesize all the other three. I mean, America was new in the sense that the Caribbean was new, but they'd done away with the old world, more or less. Whereas in the Caribbean, Africa and Europe was still very powerful culturally and socially in the society. So it was a new society, but not as new as America. And so I found myself there being able to run through the different parts of my engagement with the world, and with what I now think of as the history of Atlantic racism, if you like. And it was just an enormous boost and a synthetic moment for me. And in the course of that, I'd read everything that C.L.R. James had written, published, and I wanted to see him, and I arranged to see him. And in the process of meeting him, I met his assistant Anna Grimshaw, fell in love, and but in the meantime, I mean, I had decided I didn't want to come back to Cambridge, and I had been fishing for a job at Washington University, St. Louis, and I got an offer from them at the same time as I met James and Anna in the summer vacation between the first and second years of my Jamaica study, which is literally the best job I've ever been offered in my life. It was full professor, $80,000, half-time teaching, half-time in Douglas North's Institute of Political Economy, a research assistant, and the main say in making 5 new appointments to turn Washington University's anthropology department into the main center for anthropology and political economy in the United States.
Didn't you take this one?
Well, they made me this offer, and I went back to Jamaica, left Anna, who I just met, and as soon as I got back to Jamaica, she sent me a postcard saying, if you want to go to America, all bets are off.
Right.
That she couldn't leave James, and she had bad experience of being in America before. So I just phoned up the guy and said, you know, great job, sorry, but I met a woman. And so after that, I decided I would come back to Cambridge, and we were with James. I mean, she had been with James.
James was living here in Britain.
In Brixton, and she was working as his research assistant and general minder. And back to Cambridge now as a tenured lecturer, and until James died a couple of years later, I divided my time between Cambridge and Brixton.
Why were you so interested in James?
I felt that there has never been a writer who touched me so deeply. I mean, I've mentioned already that I felt greatly in the debt of Jack and Maya, but I have always felt since then that the only mentor I have was James, and this mentorship was achieved simply by his writing. I felt that, I mean, I read about 14 of his books when I was in Jamaica, and I felt that this thing, what he was writing, was specifically meant for me. And I wrote a very peculiar letter to him when asking to see him. And it came about in a rather kind of magical way. I mean, I was staying in a house on the north coast of Jamaica that used to belong to Errol Flynn, and I had my daughter Louise with me, and she was playing in the sea, and I was reading Anna Grimshaw's collection of James's occasional cricket writings. James was Neville Cardus's second in command as cricket correspondent for the Manchester Guardian in the 1930s, and he lived in Lancashire with Leary Constantine and so on. So I'm reading about, and I'm reading these reports of my father's cricketing heroes, watching my daughter, you know, play on the edge of a turquoise ocean in the Caribbean, you know, and I suddenly had this moment, this sense of everything collapsing into a single, you know, epiphany, if you like, in which I felt a complete sense of identity with this old man, and I realized, you know, that he and I had been moving through the same places, but in different sequence and direction, from very different starting points, but essentially Africa, Britain, the Caribbean, America. And I had, as I said earlier, I'd formed this sense that my Jamaican sojourn had given me a kind of cubist view of the relativity of all the different parts of the puzzle that would allow me to place myself at different points in the picture simultaneously. And suddenly all this cubist strategy kind of manifested itself as identifying with an old black cricket writer on a beach with my daughter. And but the groundwork for that was the fact that I never read anything but, you know, a body of work by anyone that seemed to touch me so deeply. And thanks to Anna, I had a chance to spend a couple of years with him before he died, and it was quite extraordinary. I mean, you know, he was old school. You know, he would say, "Go to Selfridges and buy me wood pigeon, Schubert, and the best claret." And or, you know, 2 weeks before he died, we watched Tiananmen Square on TV together, and he says, He says, the Soviet Union will never retain its grasp over Eastern Europe after this. Doesn't matter what the Chinese do to their own people, they're down to sit on them. But this watching the tanks and the students on, you know, he saw this as immediately as the catalyst of the collapse of the Soviet Union, not the collapse of the Chinese communists. And it turned out to be the case that same year. And he was always, from the 70s at least, he used to say there are only two world revolutions left. The Second Russian Revolution and the Second American Revolution. And he'd been predicting, I mean, ever since Solidarity, and Lech Walesa and so on, he'd been looking to Eastern Europe and the breakup of the Soviet Union as the Second Russian Revolution. And of course we're still perhaps waiting for the Second American Revolution.
I was going to say, maybe it's not going to happen.
Maybe Obama is it, or maybe not. Maybe that's a good place to stop.
Yes, let's stop there. Okay, to Obama.